the 6th, 2018 regular meeting for the James City County Planning Commission. Mr. Holt, would you call the roll?
Ms. Leverins, who's an at-large member, cannot be with us this evening. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Haldeman. Here. Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Schmidt. Here. Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District and is this year's vice chair. Mr. O'Connor. Here. Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropp. Here. Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District. And Mr. Richardson.
Here.
Mr. Richardson represents the Stonehouse District and is this year's chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left is Mr. Max Halavin, our Assistant County Attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. We now go into our public comment period. This is for topics that are not subject to a public hearing. Do you have anyone who would like to speak this evening? Okay. Seeing and hearing no one, we will move on to reports of the commission. For the Development Review Committee, Mr. Kropp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on May 23rd, 2021. Conception -0. The owners of the undeveloped acreage in the Stonehouse a DRC feedback on a land use narrative, ultimately elements of the established 2,700 acres of the Creek and preservation area and total number of homes to be. The applicant stated are in discussions with the office possible result. Also result in the reduction of 1,100 residential units located a proffered school site from Act 9 about 30. Establish a community focal point by creating a town square with a mix of neighborhood commercial use, public open space, and require infrastructure changes including part of the master plan amendment. The applicant also is amending. These were not available to the DRC, but the committee did request that the applicant prepare a matrix showing all of the original proffers and how they would be changed by the new proposal. Several residents of the Stonehouse attended the DRC meeting and were allowed to ask questions of the applicant. The applicant also stated that they would host community meetings to discuss the proposed master plan amendment. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kropp. And for our Policy Committee report, Mr. Halderman.
Good evening. The Policy Committee met on May 10th at 4 p.m. The committee continued to review strategies for addressing impacts associated with legislative cases dealing with bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, which were formally addressed through proffers per the requirements of various adopted administrative policies. In response to the committee's requests, staff added bicycle accommodations to pedestrian accommodations for interconnectivity between parcels and verbiage linking construction standards for privately maintained accommodations to established standards. VDOT's standards will apply to sidewalks and Parks and Recreation Greenways Master Plan standards to multi-use paths. The committee approved staff's recommendations and referred the amended ordinances to the Planning Commission. Staff then introduced amendments to the Zoning and Subdivision Ordinance to delete reference to fees currently spread throughout the county code. The proposed ordinance adds 5% to each development fee and consolidates them into one table in Appendix A. The increased fees will be used to defray the costs of additional resources and technology necessary to administer each of the listed programs and for the filing and processing of amendments, applications, and appeals related to each of the listed programs. The committee approved staff's recommendations and referred the amended ordinances to the full Planning Commission. Staff discussed restricting outdoor vending machines in front of buildings located along community character corridors as requested by the committee at the April meeting. Staff believes that implementing such restrictions would be difficult and the subject was dropped. Staff reviewed presentations of the Pocahontas Trail Corridor Study and the Fort Eustis Joint Land Use Study that will be shared with supervisors at the joint work session with planning commissioners on May 22nd. The committee also reviewed some of the work done on ordinance amendments in preparation for the meeting. The meeting was adjourned at 5:25 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. We now will move on. Go ahead.
Can I ask a couple of questions
Sure, Connor,
prior
please.
to, just for the DRC report? What's our next step? Will this go back to the DRC, or will it come to the Planning Commission for legislative approval?
The expect,
No, go ahead.
I think the anticipation would be it would next come as a legislative action.
The applicant didn't indicate that they plan to return to the DRC.
These were substantive proffers for this master plan some time ago, and understanding that they have changed density in land bays and that there is a golf course that I believe is part of the proffers and it's currently not maintained. You know, I would just request that we not get the proffers the day of the meeting to understand, because obviously there's going to be a lot of change, and I think, you know, I would just hope that we don't bring this to a public hearing only to defer it because it's an incomplete application and we bring out a bunch of residents to speak for or against it. So I think it's just, this is a big case, lots of proffers, so I think that we need to be prepared, so.
At that point, no, we would only advertise it if it was a complete application, and we still do have in place the policy for the proffer submittal cutoff period to ensure well in advance. Yes, this will be.
I will say, though, we went through that proffer issue in some detail, and Mr. Krapp's suggestion to that piece was that there be a matrix so that you could actually see what was either included or not included or how they came to that decision for it. I think they took that advice rather seriously.
Appreciate it, thanks.
Now we'll move on to the consent agenda. Consent agenda items are typically determined to be non-controversial. However, Planning Commissioner can pull any item for discussion, and what we have before us this evening are the minutes of the May 2nd, 2018 regular meeting.
Move to approve?
Motion to approve. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. This evening, we have three public hearings. The first public hearing is AFD-04-86-1-2017, Pates Neck Renewal. Mrs. Sula. Right again? It's a little on the low side. I think it's working.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Staff is seeking the Commission's recommendation regarding the renewal of the Pates Neck AFD. As required by state code, the county must review all established agricultural and forestal districts prior to their expiration. During this review, districts must be continued, modified, or terminated. The Pates Neck AFD is scheduled to expire on August 14th of this year. The district was originally created in 1986 and consists currently of 4 properties totaling approximately 755 acres, all of which are zoned A1 General Agricultural and designated rural lands by the adopted comprehensive plan. There have been no requests to add or withdraw land since initiating the renewal process at the end of 2017. While the district has been renewed most recently for 6-year intervals, staff is recommending a 4-year renewal period to bring this district more in step with the renewal periods of most other districts. Notably, there are 12 other districts being renewed later this year, which expire in October rather than August. Staff finds the Pates Neck AFD compatible with the requirements of state code and surrounding development and consistent with the adopted comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend renewal of this AFD for a period of 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days to October 31st, 2022 to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the attached conditions which were approved at the district's last renewal. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and there is no applicant, so I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
public hearing. Does anyone? Close the public hearing and open it up to my colleagues for discussion.
Move its approval.
I have a motion by Mr. O'Connor to recommend approval. Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Kropp.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Our next case is SUP-0004-2018, 3021 Ironbound Road Tourist Homes. Ms. Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Ms. Sharon Dennis has applied for a special use permit to allow the operation of a tourist home at 3021 Ironbound Road. The tourist home SUP will allow for the short-term rental of a two-bedroom home with no changes to the size or footprint of the home. The property is zoned R8, rural residential, and is designated low-density residential in the comprehensive plan and is located inside the primary service area, as are all surrounding parcels. Staff considered the home's location, parking provisions, and screening all to be favorable factors in the evaluation of this application. The property has an existing driveway and parking area sufficient to accommodate guests and is screened from adjacent properties through fencing and vegetation. The property is also directly adjacent to an existing tourist home of similar size and scope, whose SUP was approved by the Board of Supervisors on January 9, 2018. Staff is recommending conditions which are intended to mitigate the impacts of this use and preserve the residential character of the home. Such conditions include limitations on the number of rooms to be rented and total number of rental occupants per stay. Staff notes that there is an existing SUP to operate a daycare on this property. The applicant has stated that she is no longer pursuing the daycare, and should the tourist home be approved, the existing daycare SUP will become void. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, Zoning Ordinance, and surrounding development, and recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application subject to the conditions included in tonight's packet. At this time, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also available.
I'd like to open the public hearing. Does anyone have any comments? Seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public hearing and move on to our third and final item this evening, ZO-0004. Pardon me. Close the public hearing and open it to my colleagues for discussion and or a motion.
Chairman, I recommend approval of this, subject to the conditions.
Motion is on the floor. Mr. Holt, will you call the roll?
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor. Mr. Kropp.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. And the third and final public hearing this evening, ZO-0004-2018 and SO-0004-2018, zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance amendments to delete references to fees which are set forth in the County Code, Appendix A, fee schedule for development-related permits. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, members of the commission. If you'll so indulge me, if it's okay, I'll do a very short staff presentation from my seat up here. As previously discussed, back on May the 8th, the Board of Supervisors adopted an ordinance to create Appendix A to the County Code. The appendix consolidated fee references for development-related permits, and the effective date of that ordinance to go into effect will be July 1, which is concurrent with the start of the new fiscal year. To ensure the county code does not have duplicative or erroneous references, the fee references now listed in Appendix A must be removed from the individual chapters of the county code prior to July 1st. The set of ordinances that's been included in your agenda packets tonight are from Chapter 19, which is the Subdivision Ordinance of the county, and Chapter 24, which is the Zoning Ordinance of the county. Those ordinances and the revisions contained therein represent formatting changes only and do not contain any other substantive changes at this time. Staff recommends the Planning Commission recommend approval of the ordinance amendments to the Board of Supervisors. On May the 10th, the Policy Committee voted unanimously to move these ordinances forward to you all tonight. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Thank you. And we will open the public hearing.
And while Mr. Chairman, while we've consolidated both of these public hearings into one topic tonight, following the public hearing tonight, we would respectfully request a separate vote for the zoning ordinance amendment versus the SO case, which is the subdivision ordinance amendment.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Any comments from the public? Seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public hearing and open it to my colleagues for any further discussion and or a motion, remembering that there would be two separate for this particular item.
Chairman, recommend approval of the subdivision changes.
Motion is on the floor. Mr. Holt, will you call the roll?
Just to clarify for the record, you are making a motion to recommend approval of case number SO-0004-2018. Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Kropp.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson. Thank
Aye.
you. Motion carries.
And any further discussion and or a motion for ZO-004-2018 revisions?
Excuse me, motion to recommend approval of zoning ordinance -0004-2018.
Motion is on the floor. Mr. Holt.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Kropp.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. And we move now into Planning Commission considerations. Ms. Cook, Fort Eustis Land Use Study. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Over the last 16 months, work has progressed on creating the Fort Eustis Joint Land Use Study, or JLUS. The JLUS has been a collaborative study conducted by the 3 surrounding localities, federal officials, residents, and Fort Eustis to identify compatible land uses and growth management guidelines near the installation. The JLUS has been guided by a policy committee and a technical working group and has included significant outreach and input opportunities for the public. At the May 2018 Commission and Board joint work session, the project's lead consultant provided an overview of the study and recommendations, several of which were also highlighted in the staff memo, including recommendations regarding formalized communication, land use compatibility, policy reinforcement, and the third port mission. As described in the recommendations, implementation of the JLUS could range from administrative actions to revisions or updates in the county's zoning ordinance and comprehensive plan. The Fort Eustis JLUS is scheduled to be brought before the Board of Supervisors for formal consideration at its July meeting. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Cook.
Mr. Chairman, so as a consideration item, this item is not a public hearing, so there's no need to open a public hearing tonight. As the Planning Commission will remember, and as Ms. Cook mentioned, the sort of the substance of the JLUS and the history and all of the public input and concerns that went into it and recommendations came out were highlighted at the recent the in-depth work session that the Planning Commission had with the Board of Supervisors. Tonight really was just sort of a summary version, and since that work session was televised, and that was just a couple of weeks ago, we want to repeat that entire presentation. But again, staff is happy to answer any questions from the Commission. Otherwise, we would certainly appreciate any motions or votes that we could, or recommendations or votes that the Planning Commission may want to send forward to the Board of Supervisors.
Will it be more substantive at the Board of Supervisors?
Yeah, we'll have another month that will pass, so we'll probably do a little bit of more of a summary. Yeah.
I just think there was a lot of good information, especially when we talked about the economic impact of Fort Eustis on the region and understanding what their concerns are as far as operations go. So I thought it would be helpful, and you'll probably have a larger audience with the next Board of Supervisors.
We will. There's 2 really good resources, certainly, as all of the work sessions and all of the public meetings are televised. You can log on to the county website at any point and watch the rebroadcast of that meeting and rewatch that presentation. But also, there's also the project website for the Fort Eustis JLS, and just by Googling those terms, it should come right up. But within that, that's been maintained throughout the life of the project and just has just a wealth of information and history and all the comments that have been received, as well as a copy of the.
As I went through the draft report that you furnished for there were some suggestions in there that the board also talked about in terms of improving the communications and things like that. Is that up to the board then to decide to pursue that, or is that something that?
It is. So the report that's in front of you and the report that'll be considered by, by the Board of Supervisors is really just a set of recommendations. It is not the consideration by the commission tonight and the consideration by the board. It's not to move forward with any of those implementations. It's really just to accept the report. So, certainly I think the expectation from the Department of Defense, Office of Economic Adjustment, when they provide funds to initiate these studies, and I think certainly part of the expectations of the base is that when this study is finally accepted by the jurisdictions, and it already has by the City of Newport News, I think we included a copy of those resolutions in your staff report, that there be some proactive effort to transition from the analysis phase into the implementation portion of the project. And that's really where sort of the board's decision to allocate and direct resources towards those and to provide staff guidance on those next steps and how to get that set up and going will be invaluable. But yeah, that'll be part of hopefully a near future subsequent phase to this project.
I've got a follow-on to that. As I recall in a discussion with the Board of Supervisors, there was one suggestion about maybe a special district in the area bordering Fort Eustis along the Skiffs Creek. Is that something that the board has to initiate, or is that something that we took for an action coming out of that meeting?
I think as it's proposed in this study, that's something that could very easily be discussed during this next comprehensive plan update. You would want to have some policy basis for where that district is, what that area of influence really is, sort of defined geographically, and there's just a terrific, great place to start with that on the future land use map. So, I would bet that, again, as the Planning Commission continues its deliberations and gets into the comp plan update collaboratively with the Board of Supervisors, that will be a question that we very directly pose and get everybody's input about whether or not to include those elements in this next update. That's probably the next place to start with that.
Thank you. It would be an overlay district, right? Isn't that what they were talking about? Or?
Could be, doesn't have to be. Again, it's a recommendation. So whether or not, you choose to geographically represent that on the future land use map and then also translate that into the zoning map at a future day, those are two discrete separate actions. They can be handled one or both or neither. So it doesn't have to be.
I think we should make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to accept the report. I thought the report was excellent. As Mr. O'Connor said, just loaded with information. It doesn't bind the county to anything, as Mr. Holt pointed out. But out of respect for the countless hours that went into this, I think we should, I'd like to recommend that the Planning Commission recommend to the Board of Supervisors that they accept the report.
Simple vote. Okay, your recommendation?
As a matter of fact, I would so move.
Moved. And with that said, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. We will now move on to the Pocahontas Trail Corridor Study. Mr. Baruch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. For the past 10 months, the Planning Division, VDOT, and its consultant, RK&K, have been engaging with the Grove community to reassess the transportation needs, desired improvements, and priorities for the Pocahontas Trail Corridor Study. The purpose of the study was to reassess the corridor from Fire Station 2 to James River Elementary School and to engage the community in identifying key transportation needs and in defining a vision for the future of the corridor. This effort would not have been possible without the support of the Technical Committee and Steering Committee, many of whom are in attendance today. To gain the community's input, 3 public workshops 6 steering committee meetings, and 6 technical committee meetings, as well as several other opportunities were held in different areas throughout Grove. The public workshops and meetings provided tremendous feedback and direction to staff, VDOT, and the consultant, which has been reflected in the draft study document where the recommendations are outlined. In terms of the recommendations, Concept 1, the 3-lane concept with the shared use path on one side and the sidewalk on the other, was the preferred option. The recommended improvements also include curb and gutter to improve the drainage system, a landscape buffer area between the roadway and the sidewalk and shared use path, continuous roadway pedestrian lighting, new crosswalks with pedestrian refuges at multiple locations, transit stop improvements including bus pull-offs and shelters, and the undergrounding of overhead utilities. These recommendations are a comprehensive set of improvements which address each of the needs identified by the community and which the community determined best matched its version of the Pocahontas Trail corridor. Due to the scale of these improvements needed to address the corridor's needs and match the community's vision, the study also recommends consideration of a phased approach to constructing the improvements. While the county may pursue funding for the entire length of the corridor as one project, in an effort to secure funding, it may also be prudent to submit individual project segments or groups of segments for funding consideration should they be competitive for other various funding sources. The draft Pocahontas Trail Corridor study document was provided as an attachment to your packet. In anticipation of several funding applications due this summer, the study is scheduled to be brought before the Board of Supervisors for formal consideration at its July 10th meeting. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the draft study to the Board of Supervisors. Mr. Holt and I are available for questions if you have any time.
Mr. Chairman, just before we move into Planning Commission discussion and deliberations, to tack on a few extra words to Alex's staff presentation. I had mentioned before, from an input point of view, staff feels like this is probably one of the most successful studies we've had here in recent times, thanks entirely to the leadership of the folks who are in attendance tonight, who served on the steering committee. I think efforts to engage residents of Grove, even extended to, walking around individual streets and placing hangers on doorknobs and those types of things to generate input and interest, and just had, again, just some really, really well-attended public workshops, as Alex mentioned. So the compilation of all of that feedback is in the study that's before you. Again, as a consideration item, this item isn't open for public hearing tonight. You do have a couple of members of the steering committee who've graciously signed up in their role as steering committee representatives to add some perspective and like to provide some comment to the commission tonight. So I think that would be a really good thing. So again, much like the joint land use study, we had a really good detailed presentation with some really good animation, too, I may add, giving credit to the consultant. I wish staff could do things like that, but at the joint work session between the board just a few weeks ago, so just in the interest of time, we didn't repeat a lot of those items tonight, but likewise, by going to the county website, you can do a recap of that work session, watch all of those pieces individually, and likewise, this project also had a project website that was up and in existence from the beginning of the project, and all of the important milestone dates and the information that was.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Would there be any other questions of staff or any other comments? I know we have a.
I just have one. We had a discussion, and I don't know where we left it, about extending the study a little bit further to get us a little bit closer to Greenmount and include, I think,
That segment.
Is that an option? Is that available? How do we?
It's not an option for this particular work effort. Resources in the contract for this particular work effort were limited to the scope and the limits that you see on the screen and on the overhead in front of you. However, likewise, that was a big issue and a big recognition by the community and by the steering committee that at some point that those pieces should be included as well. So You will see in the final study some references to some anticipated costs, and again, just sort of for a sense of magnitude and sense of scale, and a sense of sort of the next level of planning, what that might entail. But certainly, I think there was recognition all around that there would be a really strong desire to continue this particular cross-section of the road all the way through for that next segment. Able to pick up those residential properties down there.
Anyone else? I have a couple of speakers this evening. First would be Glenn Carter. If you could state your name and address.
Certainly.
Thanks, sir.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Good evening, my name is Glenn Carter. I reside at 130 Jackson Street within the Grove community. I just wanted to piggyback off of Alex, and I do concur with Mr. Holt about the much-needed progress of Route 60, the Pocahontas study, the corridor. We feel, and speaking, I guess I can for the community, the Grove community, it's a much-needed study. We'd like to know how, of course, and when. We have an influx of major traffic, as you all well know. We have the industrial park, we have the Walmart distribution centers, the mega churches, which is being built. We feel that with the influx of new residents coming to the Grove community, and we're expanding foot traffic, bicycle traffic, but more importantly, emergency vehicles having the right of way and being able to pass without any obstructions to and from emergencies. The expansion of the Route 60 is most warranted.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Sir. And our next speaker is Gloria Hill. And if you would say your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gloria Hill, and my address is 112 Plantation Grove in the Grove community. I'm also speaking for the Retirement Center in Grove, Colonial Manor Retirement Facility, and our main issue with the community there is safety. We have over 50 residents, and half of the residents, they're handicapped and disabled and unable to cross the main highway. So we're hoping to provide safety for crossing or crosswalk, speed reduction or reduced, and also for bus shelters. The bus stop has been moved across the highway in front of Mount Gilead Baptist Church, and there's no shelter, no seating, no lighting. So in hopes maybe we could provide all of that for the residents at Colonial Manor. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to open it back up to my colleagues. I know, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I just want to say, kind of to reiterate some of what's already been said, but it was it was a pleasure to work as on the steering committee, to work with some of the folks who turned out tonight and others who couldn't make it tonight. But the community engagement, it worked. I kind of came into that thinking, well, RK&K was the firm that was going to kind of tell us how this should happen. But that firm and planning staff, they listened, and changes were made as we worked through some of the problems in that corridor. And absolutely, this is long overdue. In my opinion, as I see the county grow and I see these nice new amenities coming to the western parts of the county, it hasn't happened in Grove yet. I hope it's going to happen, and it should happen. And this was a great study. And again, community engagement was, that's how local government should work. And it worked very well in this case. And thank you for your countless hours and being a part of this process. And again, it was a pleasure to work with you.
It's a pleasure to see our former colleague, George Drummond, in the audience as well. Great effort. This is amazing. It's very exciting, I think, to have this move forward. Yes, sir. Would you like to speak? Please do. Please do. If you could just state your name and address for the record. Okay, great.
My name is James A. Curtis. I live at 8405 Pocahontas Trail. And thank you, gentlemen, for allowing me to have just a moment. I apologize for not filling out the blank. I represent the Little Zion Baptist Church. I chair the Board of Trustees at that church. And in our last church business meeting, we got 100% favorability of this project. It was a vote taken at the church business meeting along with the pastor and the other officers, and we all voted 100% to have this done. And I was told to come up and to let you know that's the way the community and the church feels. Please give us some consideration, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Sir, please do. Just state your name and address, please, for the record.
35-year resident, Mr. Robert Till. I run a very popular and important community garden in the Grove neighborhood for 6 years. Just about to start the 7th, but the main thing is I interact with a very great many people. And because my glasses are a little old, the only thing I request is that y'all each give your name and tell me where you're representing us. And thank you for such good Robert's Rules of Orders and things like that. It's a pleasure to be here for the first time. And it was a pleasure to deal with the Transportation Committee and trying to help serve my neighborhood. But again, my glasses are a little old. I cannot read these letters from as close as I sit. I'd be just so very grateful, sirs, if you would just state your names for me again and tell me again the district, because I should know who is representing Grove and I don't know you. But I'd like for you all to know me, and I'd like for you to visit the garden. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead, please.
Yeah,
Mr.
well, I'm your Grove, the Roberts District representative, so appointed by Supervisor McGlennon. Schmidt, S-C-H-M-I-D-D. I live in Kings Point.
Yes, sir.
Right through the woods over there.
We could work together.
Yes.
Keith Richardson from the Stonehouse District.
Rich Kropp from the Powhatan District.
Tim O'Connor, at large.
Jack Haldeman from the Berkeley District.
Frank Polster from the Jamestown.
Sir, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I was impressed with on this study was the comparison of what we went through on the Long Hill in the Jamestown district. And these processes are very long, and they go on for quite a while, and there's still a bunch of decisions yet to be made for this thing. And so one of the things that I'm hoping is that we either do something on the administrator's page or on your page that provides some kind of an update when these events are happening, when funding is going to occur, what sections are going to be done, especially as they get far enough down to the design where it starts to impact some of the neighborhoods, and when that happens, and maybe even stormwater decisions on the part of VDOT. Is that possible?
We can certainly share those updates. I was sitting here thinking, gosh, wow, 100% acceptance by one of the churches down there to get this stuff going. It's putting a little bit of pressure on staff to go obtain some funding. One of the reasons why we're back before the Planning Commission and want to get this study scheduled in front of the board as soon as possible for that their board's first meeting in July is because this next round of big funding applications at the state level are in progress now and will run through the summer. And so we sort of always wanted to provide for an extremely robust input, series of inputs and workshops into this process, but we've all along really tried to back into this date and that July date so that we can make this cutoff. The states, for their biggest pot of funding, which is the smart scale applications, have moved to an every other year application cycle. So if we're unsuccessful at getting anything in this year or getting funding this year, it'll actually be 2 years before we can apply for that big pot of funding again. And that's one of the reasons why the evolution of the study went on to include potential phasing recommendations and how to break the 2-mile corridor into subsequent smaller segments of discrete projects that we could go out and pursue some of the other smaller pots of money. But again, even those smaller pots of money, those application cycles come up this fall. So, yeah, almost all of those, especially Smart Scale, ultimately requires a resolution of support from the Board of Supervisors. So, those will bubble up this summer. We'll look to get those submitted. But, yeah, what we can do is, as part of the Planning Director's report, continue to provide updates on really all of our transportation projects and where we are. So, been very fortunate to date. We want to keep that progress and momentum rolling with the state funding and try all the pots of money, and hopefully we'll be successful.
I'd just like to thank everybody for your participation in mobilizing your community to come out and participate and support it. I think I speak for all of my colleagues that we recognize Grove needs some connectivity for folks to be able to get to and from work, to and from schools, and get around within the community in a safe fashion. So I think, I know from the presentation we had, everybody was very much in support of it, and I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to bring it forth and allow us to do this. Mr. Schmidt has given us great reports, and I just appreciate that.
And would we have a recommendation for forwarding to the Board of Supervisors?
Yes, I'll take that role. I move that we recommend to the Board of Supervisors the Pocahontas Trail Corridor Study.
So moved. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you. We'll move on now to the Planning Director's report. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much once again, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Other than what's been included in your agenda packets, I don't have any new items to report out on tonight, but would be happy to answer any questions.
Getting off easily.
Well,
it's all relative.
Barring any further questions of staff and the Planning Director, we now move to our Planning Commission discussion and requests.
Just this letter we got from the Unitarian Church there on Ironbound. Mechanisms for in local government for moving this path to nowhere. I don't know if you saw that at the end of their letter. It seems like it doesn't connect to the school. Is that? I mean, is it a VDOT thing? Is that?
No, I mean, remember, the ultimate connectivity is set forth in policy documents that are adopted by the Board of Supervisors by way of the Pedestrian Accommodations Master Plan and by way of the Regional Bikeway Study. So, that was updated here more recently, just a couple of years ago, to more right size where those corridors should be, what that connectivity should be, and what those facilities are. So there is absolutely a plan in place. Now, in terms of implementation, almost all of that does come from developer-related projects. So, yeah, it is very common to see segments, but ultimately the vision for those corridors is set forth in a very defined vision and master plan that will come to fruition at some point.
Yeah, at some point, right.
Yeah.
Well, considering that a piece of that property is the school, how does the school move forward to extend that corridor up to Tyler?
So again, we mentioned a little bit earlier, certainly resources are always limited at the local level. At some level there would be an opportunity as part of the capital improvements budgets to include that as an individual segment. But again, those resources are so limited. County staff just, again, always have a really good working relationship with the schools and the school staff. We actually, earlier this calendar year, speaking of transportation funding, we sought an application from VDOT to provide funding for all of that connectivity and to include those sidewalk improvements. We were not successful and sort of got filtered out at the initial read on that at the regional level. Remember, all of these transportation improvement applications are highly competitive, and they're all reviewed in relation to all of the other requests that are put in by all of the other localities that make up Hampton Roads. So we're in competition with, 15, 17 other localities. And, again, there's always more great ideas than there are construction dollars to move around. So unfortunately, that one, and we had one or two others that we had submitted as well that just didn't bubble up high enough in the competitive ranking to get funded. But, again, I think that's another example where we'll continue to see it's a very good idea. It's a very good and fleshed out idea. We have a really good sense, again, in partnership with the schools and VDOT about some improvements that can be made there. We just have to find a funding source that we bubble up high enough on to get that going. So, that may be, we weren't successful for that particular application type. We may try again with some of these other ones.
This is a follow-on. I mean, I was really surprised to find out that the Ironbound wasn't a corridor, and then wondered whether or not there was some documentation within the comp plan that kind of described what was envisioned for that. And the same is really true for the other corridor programs. And follow on to that is, are you guys going to reply to the church?
Well, the context of this letter came in as a support for that particular
I took
SUP.
I took the, oh, by the way, can you tell me what's going on with this? We put money into this. Are you guys doing your half of it? That's the way I read it. I mean, I would think you'd want to reply to the man.
Again, to the degree that we have a path forward with funding and get some of that done, we'll absolutely keep them in the loop.
Thank you, Mr. Polster. Anyone else? All that I have for this evening is remembering that it is D-Day. All of those boys that gave their lives on all those beaches to make us free should be remembered. And I understand a group of them are trying to get together next year to go and visit for the 75th. It's quite amazing. So, are any other comments?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. So moved. All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.